Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Dollar Dialogue. Today's episode is episode 21, Russia's Sanctioned Economy, Self-Reliance or Global Isolation. And with us here, we have Mr. Rohan Mahadik to talk about this very important economic and political issue. Mr. Rohan Mahadik is a junior at Heritage International Experiential School in Gurgaon, in the Republic of India. We're very excited to have him with us here today. He's a very talented individual when it comes to political, economic affairs. He has been doing Model United Nations for a couple of years now, and he has a very much in-depth knowledge about this kind of issues. And he is a very talented individual that all of us know. And he is doing currently IBDP Global Politics in his school in Gurgaon, in Republic of India. And we're very happy and we're very excited to have him with us here today. Mr. Rohan Mahadik, is there anything that you would like to add to the introduction that I've just said?
I'm just really excited to be here and honored to be part of this podcast. I'm looking forward to some interesting discussions about the topic.
Thank you, Mr. Rohan Mahadik. And now let's get into this topic of discussion, which is episode 21, Russia's Sanctioned Economy, Self-Reliance or Global Isolation. So let's talk a little bit about Russia's economy before it was sanctioned. And we would like to draw a clear border. When was Russia sanctioned, and how its economy looked before it was sanctioned and how it looked after. And Russia was first sanctioned in 2000, not first, but Russia was heavily sanctioned after 2014 when it annexed the region of Crimea from Ukraine. And before 2014, Russia's economy was primarily driven by natural resources, particularly oil and natural gas, which made up 60% exports and contributed to about 40% of government revenue. And other key sectors included metals, chemicals, agriculture, with Russia being a top exporter of wheat and fertilizers. And Russia was one of the world's largest oil producers, with daily production reaching 10 million barrels per day in 2013, accounting for 12% of global output. And before the sanctions were placed in Russia, Russia's nominal GDP in 2013 was approximately $2.23 trillion, making it the eighth largest economy at the time. And its GDP in terms of purchasing power parity was closer to $3.5 trillion, reflecting that it was a very strong economy. And it was heavily also based on government spending and consumptions. And Russia also experienced robust growth in the 2000s, with the GDP growth rates averaging 6 to 7% per year between 2000 and 2008, primarily due to high energy prices and political stability. However, growth began to slow by 2013, with GDP growing by only 1.3% in 2013, reflecting economic vulnerabilities and growing inefficiencies. And Russia, most of the time, maintained budget surpluses leading up to 2014, thanks to its high oil revenues. And the government created two stabilization funds, and they called them the National Welfare Fund and the Reserve Fund, which together accumulated over $170 billion by 2013, helping Russia manage oil price volatility. And Russia had a very low public debt burden, with the government debt standing at just 13.4% of GDP in 2013, making it one of the lowest in the world. And Russia's economy was highly dependent on exports, particularly to Europe, which was its largest market for oil and gas. In 2013, about 75% of Russia's gas exports were delivered to European markets, and major trading partners including Germany, China, Netherlands, and Italy. And total exports in 2013 amounted to around $527 billion, while imports stood at $341 billion. And Russia was also part of key international economic organizations like the World Trade Organization, WTO, since 2012, and the G20, positioning it as a major player in global economic diplomacy. And the Russian currency, which was known as the ruble, remained relatively stable between 2005 and 2013, though it started to experience some pressure from capital inflows in the lead up to the sanctions period. And inflation in Russia was historically high, but had moderated in the years before sanctions. In 2013, inflation stood at around 6.8%, down from 10% in the early 2000s. And Russia also attracted foreign direct investment in energy, infrastructure, and retail sectors, with foreign direct investment inflows of approximately $17 billion in 2013, reflecting coincidence in the economy despite political risk. And despite growth in foreign investment, Russia's business environment was often criticized for high levels of corruption, bureaucracy, and state interference. And according to the World Bank's Doing Business 2013 report, Russia ranked 92nd out of 189 economies for ease of doing business, lagging behind many of its peers. And Russia also had relatively low unemployment rate, standing at around 5.5% in 2013, and wages in Russia rose consistently between 2000 and 2013, though there were growing concerns about economic inequality with a significant gap between urban centers like Moscow and rural regions. And Russia also faced long-term demographic challenges with a declining population due to low birth rates, an aging population, and a relatively low life expectancy of around 70 years. And the Central Bank of Russia, CBER, also played a key role in stabilizing the economy and managing inflation, with interest rates set to target inflationary measures. And Russia also had a relatively developed banking sector, though it was dominated by state-owned institutions like SBA. I don't know how to pronounce it properly, but it's SBER Bank and VTB. And capital flight also was a major issue for Russia's in the lead up to the sanctions before 2013. In 2013 alone, capital outflows totaled around $62 billion, reflecting growing concerns about political risk and economic uncertainty. And also, Russia invested heavily in its energy infrastructure, particularly pipelines like Nord Stream to Germany and Blue Stream to Turkey, to solidify its position as a key energy supplier. And major investments were also made in transport infrastructure, such as the Sochi Winter Olympics projects in 2014, though many of them were criticized for inefficiency and cost overruns. And Russia's economy benefited from the political stability under Vladimir Putin, who had centralized authority all over Russia. And for this reason, there was a predictable and consistent economic policies. And prior to 2014, Russia maintained relatively cooperate economic relations with Western countries, though tensions had been arising due to geopolitical conflicts, especially concerning Ukraine and Syria. So this is a very brief introduction about Russia's economy before 2014, before it was heavily sanctioned because of its annexation of Crimea from Ukraine. So are there any information or any opinions that you would like to add to the things that I've just said? Arif Malik, Shazib Karim, and Rohan Mahadik? Shazib, I see your hand is raised. Would you like to add anything?
Okay, sure. Araf, you already covered, you already focused on what happened before the sanctions occurred. So, I'd say, like, in my opinion, if we look at the move towards self-reliance, I'd say that one of the most significant effects of these sanctions has been Russia's pursuit of economic self-reliance, or, as they call it, import substitution. And after foreign companies and investors withdrew from Russia, domestic industries had to step up. Agriculture has been a major success story, as Russia is now one of the world's largest grain exporters, driven by increased domestic production after sanctions cut off European imports. And also, additionally, the Russian tech companies have been working on creating alternatives to Western technologies, with the giants such as Microsoft, Apple, and Google all halting their services. So the Russian government has been investing in domestic software and hardware solutions, and for for example, if we can also look at we can also see that Russia's national payment system Mir has become more prominent after Visa and MasterCard suspended operations in Russia. So, and in my opinion, I'd say that this shift to homegrown industries is a part of a broader strategy to insulate the Russian economy from future sanctions. But like, how effective has it been? I'd say that while there are pockets of success, the challenges of scaling this self-reliance are significant. Yeah.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with Shazib over here, and I would also like to say that the landscape of Russia has been significantly impacted by the international sanctions. I mean, primarily in 2014, there were a couple of sanctions, but I think the sanctions really took a hit in the Russian economy after the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. And firstly, I would say the sanction has restricted Russia's access to the international financial markets, for example, and for
international financial markets, and also like this has constrained, I would say, the Kremlin's ability to finance its activities, and also has led to default on external debt, the first in decades, according to the World Economic Forum. But primarily, I would say the energy sector of Russia, which is a critical component of the Russian economy, has been hit hard. The European Union, which is a major importer of Russian energy, particularly gas, has significantly reduced its intake. And for instance, there has been a dramatic drop in gas flows to Europe by about 90% since the conflict began, with EU imports of Russian energy plunging as sanctions phased out coal, crude oil, and refined its oil products. And I would say this has forced Russia to redirect its energy towards Asia, specifically India and China, altering the global energy trade dynamics very significantly. And also, I would say the sanction has impacted the Russian people a lot, especially those with substantial monetary means. For example, like I'm a big fan of this club called Chelsea, which plays in the Premier League. And if I'm not mistaken, the owner of Chelsea was Roman Abramovich, who was a Russian billionaire. Some say he was an oligarch, some say he wasn't. That's for the audience to decide. But Roman Abramovich was a Russian billionaire, and soon after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, his company, his entire shares of Chelsea was basically stripped off. And like this shows that international sanction has very had a very negative impact on Russian businessmen, though, and those who have close connections to Putin. And one more thing that I would like to talk about is the fact that the impact of sanction is somewhat mitigated by some of the Russian adaptation policies. For example, I would say Russia has shifted its trade and financial services towards non-Western countries, notably China and notably through BRICS. And therefore, I would say that the sanction has had an impact on self-reliance rather than global isolation, because don't get me wrong, Russia is not an autarky like North Korea. They still do trades, but I would say the trade that they do with has shifted from Western countries to more non-Western countries and those who are part of the BRICS community. So Rohan, would you like to add anything, or would you like to chime in?
Yeah, I definitely have agreed with what Arib and Shazib have sort of said so far. And I think I do agree with the fact that a lot things to do with the fact that Russia has been sanctioned has a lot to do with their sort of conflict with Ukraine, especially if you look at it all the way from the back of the all the way back to the annexation of Crimea in 2014. It's only gotten like worse after that. Like we can see Russia's economy before the sanctions. They were, of course, very energy dominant, oil and natural gas, as Araf had mentioned, and like 30 to 40% of government revenue came from energy exports. But after the first wave of sanctions, there were like a lot of asset freezes, probably travel bans, as well as the fact that Russian banks' access to global capital markets was sort of limited. And this also hurt a lot of their energy sector because, again, like Araf and both of you had mentioned as well before, it was a big part of their economy. And it's only gotten worse after the sanctions from their full-scale invasion or their conflict with Ukraine in 2022 and after that. Because the fact that these sanctions have occurred from the European Union and Western countries shows that they cannot really look towards sort of opening up there and diversifying their economy towards that area, and they have to look at countries more in Asia instead. And the impact of these sanctions has caused economic disruptions by mitigating Russia's energy export revenues. And sort of new sanctions have also aimed to isolate Russia. So essentially what we're looking at is after these sanctions, they have to be a lot more self-reliant, and self-reliance, of course, can show some degree of success depending on Russia's strategies. But again, they have this huge sort of danger of facing global isolation. And if that happens, it would definitely hinder their economy and their ability to meet government expectations.
Yeah, Robert, I
Thank you.
fully agree with you. And to just chime in a little bit, I think Arif had mentioned this already about Abramovich, Chelsea's owner, who getting sanctioned by the UK government. So I'm also a big Chelsea fan, and I think this him getting sanctioned also had like big effects, and it was also like I found it really interesting because at the time I could see how the club was suffering a lot because Chelsea as a club they couldn't even sell new tickets, and only season ticket holders were allowed to attend games, and of course the club's revenue streams were disrupted, including merchandise sales and sponsorship deals, as some sponsors paused their agreements because of this. And I'd say that yeah, now looking back at it, like when Abramovich got sanctioned, it really impacted like other factors such as the Chelsea Football Club as well a lot. Yeah.
Thank you, Shazib Karim, Arif Malik, and Rohan Mahadik for all the information and all the opinions that have been shared. Again, to this topic of discussion is episode 21, Russia's sanctioned economy, self-reliance or global isolation. And I think we should focus a little bit on that part as well. Whether this sanctioned economy has caused a self-reliance in Russia and themselves or global isolation. Again, the common public perception or the common public belief right now in the world is there is no economy that's self-reliant, and that's also a thing that I completely believe in. Like even if you the economy that's very close to self-reliant would probably be North Korea, but it's also still reliant on other countries such as China for foreign funds, for foreign food, for foreign machineries and other things, and also I think a little bit from Russia as well. So there's no self-reliant economy in the world, but let's talk a little bit about whether the sanctioned economy of Russia has caused it to be self-reliant or has caused it to be totally isolated from the global world. And some people might say that, oh yeah, those two things are very similar, or that those two things are very the same, because when at the time, at one hand, self-reliance basically means that you are not relying on other countries, which also leads to global isolation. But what we mean by self-reliance is that they are reliant only on themselves, they rely only on their economy, and the reason they're only reliant on their economy, or they're reliant on economies of their neighboring countries, our friendly nations, such as Russia's friendly nation would include countries such as China, Kazakhstan, and former Soviet bloc countries. That's what we mean by self-reliance, that they are dependent on themselves and other former Soviet bloc countries and countries that are very friendly towards them, or global isolation, which basically means that Russia has shut its door to the entire world, and it is just a closed territory for others to do business in. So that's the two main difference between the two terms, self-reliance or global isolation. By self-reliance, again, we mean that Russia is only dependent on itself and its former Soviet bloc members or its friendly countries, which may also include countries in Africa as well. Or global isolation, which basically means that Russia has shut itself out from the rest of the world. So let's talk a little bit about that part as well. So as for the sanctions timeline, in 2014, Russia was initially sanctioned because of its annexation of Crimea, and these sanctions targeted Russia's financial, energy, and defense sectors, and included travel bans on key individuals. And following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the UK, the US, and EU and others implemented several sanctions that aim to cripple Russia's economy by targeting all exports, banking, and access to technology. Moreover, there was also sanctions on key sectors. For example, on financial sectors, major Russian banks like SBER Bank, VTB, and Gazprom Bank were cut off from the SWIFT financial network, limiting their ability to engage in international transactions. And Russia also lost access to approximately $3 billion of its foreign reserve, which were held abroad due to asset freezes, which accounted nearly for half of its total reserves. And while Russia was initially able to continue on oil and gas exports, the EU and the US imposed significant restrictions on energy exports, particularly oil, which makes up 40% of Russia's federal budget revenues and more than 50% of total exports. And the EU imposed a partial oil embargo in 2022, aiming to phase out 90% of Russian oil exports, Russian oil imports by the end of the year. And export controls also restricted Russia's access to critical technologies, including semiconductors, which affected industries such as defense, aviation, and electronics. And Russian defense and aerospace industry struggled to replace imported components, hampering production of aircraft and military equipment. And there was also a lot of GDP contraction of Russia's economy after the sanctions were placed. For example, Russia's GDP contracted by 2.1% in 2022, far less than initially predicted. IMF forecasted a decline of 8 to 10%, demonstrating some short-term resilience. Again, if you look at the IMF side or the Western side, they will say that the Russian economy has totally collapsed. But if you look at the Russian side, yes, with that the Russian economy is doing very good, but from based on the data, we see that Russia's economy was negatively impacted in some modest manner because of the sanctions, because they decreased by 2.1% in 2022. However, the World Bank estimated that Russia's long-term economic growth potential has been severely damaged, predicting a cumulative output loss of $190 billion by 2026 due to sanctions. And the industrial sector, particularly manufacturing relying on foreign imports, saw a 4.6% contraction in 2022. And the services sector, accounting for 50% of GDP, suffered significant disruptions due to sanctions on transportation, finance, and trade. And Russia's inflation surged to 17.8% in 2022, driven by a combination of supply chain disruptions, currency devaluation, and rising import costs. And food prices also saw some of the largest increases, with staples like sugar and sunflower oil rising by 30 to 50% in 2022. And following the invasion of Ukraine, the ruble initially, which is the currency of Russia, initially collapsed, losing nearly 40% of its value against the US dollar. However, it recovered after aggressive interventions by the Russian central bank, including capital controls and interest rate hikes. And by late 2022, the ruble became one of the strongest performing currencies due to restrictions on foreign currency transactions and demand for rubles in energy trade with non-Western countries like China and Russia. And this is one of the main reasons this happened, is because Russia, not forced, but they heavily influenced other countries such as China and India to take ruble to accept ruble as a payment. And for this reason, the ruble became one of the strongest performing currencies in late 2022. And there was also a pivot to domestic production, and this is where we see a lot of self-reliance factors coming in, because the domestic production meant that they were using a lot of resources that they had imported from their former Soviet bloc countries, and also a lot of resources they had imported from countries in Africa. And in response to the sanction, Russia launched an ambitious program of food import substitution, aiming to replace critical imports, particularly in technology, food, and industrial goods. And the Russian government has allocated over $25 billion in subsidies to support industries such as agriculture, machinery, and pharmaceuticals. And the share of locally produced food in the Russian market increased, with self-sufficiency in grains reaching over 95% by 2022. And agriculture output grew by 4.6% in 2022, driven by increased domestic demand. And despite efforts to develop domestic industries, technological gaps have been harder to we feel. And the automotive industry saw production decline by over 60% in 2022 due to the exit of major Western firms like Ford, Volkswagen, and Renault, and over shortages of essential parts. And the Russian aviation sector, which relied heavily on Western components for aircraft maintenance, has struggled to keep planes operational, leading to grounding of part of the fleet and reusing parts from older planes. And while sanctions targeted Russia's ability to export all to Western markets, Russia redirected all exports to Asia, particularly to China and India. And by 2023, these countries became the largest buyers of Russian crude. And however, Russia has been forced to sell its oil at a significant discount, up to 30% below the global benchmarks, to attract non-Western buyers. And for this reason, we have seen a lot of Russian oil being bought by countries such as India. And despite this, oil revenues remain strong in 2022 due to global high oil prices, which average around $100 per barrel. And so this is a very brief introduction of Russia's economy after the sanctions were placed. And what we see here is that Russia is moving to a very self-reliance economy, not global isolation. Again, the difference between these two words is that by self-reliance, we're assuming self-reliance means that Russia is dependent on itself and other pro-Russian countries, which may include African countries, which may include countries in the former Soviet bloc, and may also include countries such as India and China. While global isolation means that Russia is totally has shut itself from the rest of the world and is only dependent on itself. So that's those are the two borders we're drawing. Those are the borders we're drawing between the terms self-reliance and global isolation. So are there any more information or any opinions that you would like to add to the things that I've just said? Shazib, Karim, Arif, Malik, and Rohan, Mahadik. Arif, Malik, I see that your hand is raised. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. The mic wasn't turning on. Yeah, so I would like to add to the fact that while Russia's GDP, as you said, was contracting in 2022 by 2.1%, the pre-war forecast actually estimated that the Russian economy would shrink as much as up to 10%. But we can see that the contraction wasn't as severe as we had hoped for, and that I attribute to one reason, and that's the reason is that Russia has many allies that are non-Western countries, and we have to understand this from an ideological perspective. Russia has after World War II, Russia has always had a bad blood sort of relationship with the West, particularly with the United States. And if I'm not mistaken, Russia is the most sanctioned country in the world. It's like one of the most sanctioned countries in the world after probably North Korea, or it's up there definitely. And the Russian economy is still, it's not that bad. Like as of 2024, it's still $1 trillion economy, and it still has a plethora of natural abundant resources. But once again, the GDP shock, like personally in 2022, I thought the Russian economy would collapse, but that still hasn't been the case yet. And I would attribute to the fact that Russia has many trade partners like China and India. If I'm not mistaken, the as of 2022, Russia's oil to India has increased from 100,000 barrels per day to around 1 million barrels per day, showing that Russia and India are particularly in very good terms in terms of trade. And we also have to understand that Russia basically has the energy, one of the largest energy sector resources in the world. Basically, there was a article that the Guardian published like 5 months ago. It was saying that German, like basically it talked about German situation and how much it has plummeted since the war. So Germany was basically freezing to death because of the sanctions, and because Russia also tried to stop the energy, the oil, and the gas that they import to Germany. And we could see this all around Europe. The energy prices have soared tremendously. The consumer price index is through the roof. The inflation is through the roof. Even the ECB, the European Central Bank, has had a difficult time in order to manage this high economic high economic economic prices. And therefore I would say that Russia's in fact not that deep into the trenches as some people might assume. And also I would like to add to the fact that while the GDP contraction wasn't as severe, there's also an element that we haven't really discussed yet, and it's the fact that that there has been a lot of labor market and demographic shifts since the sanctions started. Particularly, I would like to talk about the unemployment in Russia, and the fact is that there's a lot of, despite the Russian government's fiscal policy, which increasingly focuses on defense spending. The lot of Russian people are unemployed, and as a result of this, we are seeing this brain drain situation in Russia, where according to estimates, over 500,000 people, many of them highly skilled professionals in like engineering, scientific research, and finance, has left Russia in 2022 alone. And this exodus of human capital, which is what we call brain drain, it has serious implications for the productivity growth of Russia. And the outflow of skilled laborers is likely to have a long-term negative impact on the total factor productivity, which I believe will further limit Russia's growth perspective. So in my perspective, as long as the war with Ukraine is going on, Russia will continue to suffer. But if Russia and Ukraine can sort of reach an agreement or treaty, then I think the Russian economy could sort of mitigate some of these negative externalities. So Shazib or Rohan, would you agree with me, or do you have any similar sentiments?
Yeah, I definitely agree with what you've said so far, Arif. I think there are a lot of key factors behind the GDP contraction mentioned by both you and Araf, including the sanctions. There's also things such as energy exports, investment outflows, and sort of domestic inflation. And it can all sort of be traced back to at the start of the sanctions with the oil price shock. After the annexation of Crimea in 2014, the European Union started to impose all these sanctions and targeting specific sectors such as finance, energy, and defense, which are really big for Russia. Most of their GDP sort of comes from energy, as discussed earlier. And we can see as well between 2017 and 2019, there was a bit of a recovery phase, primarily due to higher oil prices and efforts to diversify from dependence on Western imports. But then again, with the invasion of Ukraine and more sanctions, the country faced an unprecedented wave of international sanctions, and it targeted again key sectors. And one of the big things here was the fact that Russian banks were banned from the SWIFT international payment system. Energy exports and high tech industries were also targeted, and we can see that the actual contraction, the economy was projected to shrink by as much as 8 to 10% in 2022, but the actual contraction was slightly less. And the projection for 2023 suggested continued contraction, and again, it kept on falling. So again, like you had mentioned before, this sort of decline has always been prevalent ever since the sanctions, which that can be traced back to, but there are other factors as well. And this again ties into the bigger picture of the fact that moving forward, is it feasible in the long term to look at self-reliance or rather global isolation?
Yeah, I'd agree with everything you guys said. And to add my opinion, I'd say that as we discussed earlier, sectors like agriculture and other sectors have flourished under these conditions, right? And Russia has been able to develop its own food supply chain and even position itself as a leading global exporter of wheat. Likewise, domestic industries such as IT and manufacturing have been pushed to innovate, as we already mentioned before. And Russian companies are working on developing homegrown alternatives to Western software and technology, especially after losing access to companies like Microsoft and Apple. And so, because of this, I'd say that this import substitution strategy designed to replace Western imports with domestically produced goods has also seen significant government investment as Russia's state led economic policies aimed at insulating its economy from further sanctions have given a lifeline to sectors like banking, where domestic payment systems have replaced international systems like Visa and Mastercard, as we already mentioned before. And I'd say that in some ways, sanctions have forced Russia to strengthen its domestic capabilities and rely less on foreign goods and services. But however, I'd say that the push for self-reliance has come at a steep cost, of course, as while Russia may be less dependent on the West, it has found itself increasingly isolated from the global economy. And Western sanctions have restricted Russia's access to critical international markets, limiting its ability to trade with major economic powers. And the exclusion of Russian banks from the SWIFT system, a key global financial network, has made it far more difficult for Russian businesses to operate internationally, leading to a sharp drop in foreign investment. And I'd say that even beyond finance, sanctions have severely impacted Russia's high-tech industries, with Western companies halting exports of semiconductors and other key technologies. As Russia has faced challenges in modernizing its energy sector, automating in its manufacturing, and even maintaining certain military capabilities. And also, while domestic alternatives are being developed, these efforts are far from replacing the cutting edge technologies that were previously imported from the Europe, the US, and other advanced economies.
Thank you, Shazib Karim, Arif Malik, and Rohan Mahadik for all sharing. I have a question for you with concerning the Indian purchases of Russian oil. How do you see this as an Indian? That Russia's oil has been purchased by your government. Even though Russia is dying, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is obviously not a positive thing because it has killed a lot of people. It has displaced a lot of people, but at the same time, India is a sovereign country, and they have the right to do their actions as they see fit. And obviously, Russia offered India oil at a very cheap price, at a discount price. But do you think it was ethical for India to buy Russian oil while Russia was waging a war on Ukrainian soil?
Thank you for the question, Araf. I personally believe that people can have opinions on this, and it's quite subjective for some people. I mean, I don't want to specifically comment on whether it was ethical or not for India to purchase this, but I can provide some details into what exactly was going on, right? So the pre-war scenario was the essentially limited exports, right? India imported a very small percentage of its total crude oil from Russia, but post-war there were of course surges in the oil imports. It was, I believe, there was an EU embargo on seaborne Russian oil at $60 per barrel, and India took advantage of these discounts. And Russia had become one of India's top three oil suppliers, with imports from Russia jumping to nearly 1 million barrels per day. So we can look at sort of strategic and economic drivers for India here. There were price discounts. There was, of course, energy security, and the fact that India has maintained a neutral and diplomatic stance on the Ukraine conflict. They haven't really sort of They haven't really sort of taken a strong side on either, and they've been quite neutral throughout this. So, in terms of looking at this as an ethical move, I don't think personally we really have to comment on whether it was ethical or not. It's just important to understand the country's sort of viewpoint and look at the reasons for these imports. They've maintained a strong neutral stance, and of course the fact that this discount range from like $20 to $35 per barrel was of course an important factor as well. And India and Russia have been working on, I believe, some alternative payment mechanisms as well, due to the fact that Russia cannot sort of have the SWIFT international payment method, and there were some caps on Western price caps and sanctions on Russian oil as well. So I would like to hear what others also have of their opinion in terms of this relationship between India and Russia developing.
Based on my perspective, I believe India did what they had to do, and the primary reason I believe so, because you have to first understand that India has, I believe, 1.4 billion people right now, and it is the world's most populated country. While at the same time, its GDP per capita is only around $2,000. So it's one of the it's obviously growing. The economy is growing, but still there are many many people who are poor in India, and many people who do not have access to basic sanitation. For this reason, I believe that the purchase of Russian oil by India, India did it for its own sake. Like, it got cheap oil for its people. It was obviously cheap oil. It probably helped to bring down cost of production in India, which obviously helped its people. And India has a lot of poor people, and for this reason, I believe that the actions that were done by India, even though from a perspective of Ukraine, it was not justified. But if I'm a Indian, if I'm a if I'm an economically disadvantaged Indian, I believe that the oil purchase were probably beneficial for me, because it brought down the cost of food for my family, because those oils were used oils were used to in vehicles, and those vehicles obviously transport the food and other things, and obviously this also probably brought down the food prices in India a little bit. And as an Indian, if I were an Indian, and if I were to live in a village, and if I didn't have enough money, if the food prices went down, it would obviously have benefited me and my family. So that's my opinion. Are there any opinions that Arif Malik or Shazib Karim that you would like to share on this topic?
Yeah, Araf and Rohan. Yeah, I would agree with you guys regarding the fact that India has drastically increased its imports of Russian oil. If I'm not mistaken, around 2021, like the pre Ukraine, India imported like less than 100,000 barrels per day. But after the Russian war or annexation on Ukraine, it has since the figures are risen to around 1 million barrels. And I think, like, we have to understand the fact that, like, India historically has been part of this non-alignment policy since the 1950s, which India's first Prime Minister Nehru established to preserve India's sovereignty in global affairs. And by refusing to formally align with either the West or the Soviet blocs, India sought to chart its own course, ensuring that they didn't have to align with any particular nation or any particular group of nations. And I would say that India has also, as Rohan was saying, has maintained a neutral position on the Russian-Ukraine conflict. since it began. And I would say while Western countries led by EU and the United States have imposed comprehensive sanctions on Kremlin, on Russia, and has diplomatically isolated Moscow, I would say India has refused to condemn Russia directly, and instead they have like sort of called for like a dialogue and peaceful resolution and abstaining from the votes in against Russia in the United Nations assemblies. And I would say like we have to understand this from like a little bit of historical perspective. So like in like the 19 Russia usually supported India in conflicts against Pakistan, and also like Russia remains India's largest defense supplier, accounting for like 60% to 70% of India's military hardware and major systems like the S-400 missile defense system, and like the Su-30 MKI fighter jets and the supersonic cruise missiles are critical to India's national security, which they trade with Russia. And I would say like as a result of this, India cannot like really go against Russia. But on the other hand, the United States is also one of the largest contributors of the foreign direct investment of India, and the US also helps India a lot, particularly in the technological sector, in the technological sector as well. So because of this, I would say India tries to balance the waters, and they don't try to particularly go on any sides, and this is reflected in their stance as well. So Shazib, would you like to agree with me here as well, or like what's
Yeah, of course. I would agree with you, and also so from the discussions and opinions shared about this question, I'd say like reflecting on this and thinking about if it is a good decision for India. In my personal opinion, I'd say from a short-term economic perspective, it does appear to be, as the benefits of securing an affordable energy supplies and maintaining a steady flow of defensive equipment are undeniable, of course. And India's approach has allowed it to navigate the global energy crisis more effectively than many other nations. And its independent foreign policy is respected by many countries. But the long-term implications are more complicated, as India's relationship with Russia might create friction with the West, particularly if the geopolitical situation worsens, and India could face increasing pressure to distance itself from Russia, potentially forcing it to make difficult choices. Additionally, Russia's growing reliance on China introduces another layer of risk, as India might find itself caught in the middle of a deeper Russia-China alignment. And at the end of the day, India's decision to continue engaging with Russia is based on pragmatism, balancing its immediate economic needs with its long-standing foreign policy principles. But whether this decision will stand the test of time, especially in an increasingly polarized global environment, remains to be seen.
Thank you, Shazib Kaur, Arif Malik, and Rohan Mahadik for all the opinions that have been shared. And now let's talk a little bit about the thing, and that's my personal opinion, but I believe that it has been supported by data, that Russia is entering into a very, you could say, self-reliant economic mode, because Russia's traditional trading relationship, especially with Europe, have been severely disrupted. Before the 2022 sanctions, 40% of Russia's oil exports went to the EU, but this has dropped sharply as the EU sought to cut its energy dependence on Russia, and the natural gas exports to Europe fell by 80%, exacerbated by the explosion of the Nord Stream pipelines, and EU's push for alternative supplies like Norway, Algeria, and the US. And China has emerged as Russia's most significant trading partner, accounting for 20% of its total trade in 2022. And bilateral trade between Russia and China surged to over $190 billion, a 30% increase from 2021. And China became a major buyer of Russian oil, coal, and gas, while exporting electronics and machinery. And India also became a key market for Russian energy, with Russian oil exports to India increasing by 400% between February and December 2022. And India and Russia began conducting trade in local currencies to bypass Western financial sanctions. And I believe this is very crucial, which highlights that the two nations have been developing a very closer bond than before. And real wages in Russia, unfortunately, has declined by 7.5% in 2022, with the largest drop seen in manufacturing services sectors. And poverty rates increased from 11% in 2021 to 12.6% in 2022, as inflation eroded household incomes, particularly for low-income families. And over 1,000 multinational companies, and this is a very key important number, 1,000, including McDonald's, IKEA, Shell, and BP, withdrew from Russia in 2022. And this has not only resulted in job losses but also has disrupted supply chains, particularly in retail and consumer goods. And Russia's replacement for this company, such as, I believe it is called Tasty period, which replaced McDonald's, have struggled to replicate the same scale and product quality. And sanctions and growing authoritarianism has also led to a significant brain drain, which was talked by Arif. Over 500,000 Russians, many of the skilled professionals in tech and finance, have fled the country since 2022. So this has highlighted that Russia is moving into a very self-reliant mode, and it's on global isolation. It's on global isolation because they have still contact with pro-Russian countries such as India and China. So, are there any more information opens that you would like to add to the things that I've just said? Arif Malik, Shazib Karim, or Rohan Mahadik? Shazib, I see that your hand is raised. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, sure, Araf. So you're talking about Russia's trade partners, and of course, as you already mentioned, they're probably their largest trade partner is China. And also to look at another aspect, and to look at, like, we can also look at Turkey, as we also already also talked about India. And if we look at Turkey, I'll say that another important partner for Russia is Turkey, as while Turkey is a member of NATO, it has maintained a complex and somewhat ambiguous relationship with Russia, often acting as a mediator between Russia and the West. In terms of trade, Turkey has become a critical conduit for goods flowing in and out of Russia, especially as Western sanctions tighten. And Turkey imports Russian energy, particularly natural gas. And it has also increased its agricultural trade with Russia. And Turkish companies have also played a role in providing Russia with certain goods that are no longer accessible due to sanctions, acting as intermediaries for the flow of products like electronics and machinery. And this growing trade relationship has positioned Turkey as a key partner in helping Russia with some of the effects of Western sanctions. However, Turkey's balancing act between maintaining its NATO commitments and fostering ties with Russia remains a delicate one, especially as tensions between Russia and NATO continue to become simmer. And I'd say that also, if we can also look at other BRICS nations, because Russia has also strengthened its trade ties with other BRICS nations, including Brazil and South Africa. And these countries, like India and China, have not imposed sanctions on Russia and continue to trade with Moscow. And Brazil has become a key agricultural partner, with Russia importing large amounts of Brazilian food products, particularly meat. In return, Russia supplies Brazil with fertilizers, which are critical for the country's agricultural industry. And this mutual exchange has helped both economies, particularly as global food and fertilizer supplies have been disrupted by the conflict in Ukraine. And South Africa, while not a major trading partner on the scale of China or India, it still remains an important player within BRICS as it continues to engage in trade with Russia, particularly in areas like mining and natural resources. And it has maintained a neutral stance on Western sanctions.
Rohan Mahadik, I also see your hand raised. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, of course. I definitely sort of chiming in here. I would like to talk about, on the topic of self-reliance in terms of Russia's economy. I think an important question to pose would be, is it sustainable in the long term, or would they inevitably sort of face global isolation? Like, Currently, I believe they're sort of partial self-reliance because they're making a lot of efforts towards it. Because when we look all the way back to the earlier sanctions, we can see that there was an increase in agriculture and food production. Like Russia's wheat production surged after 2014, after the first sanctions, and they were exporting, and they export millions of tons of wheat annually to countries like Turkey, Egypt, and Algeria. And there was later as well energy sector dominance, which Russia's oil and gas sector. It's essentially been like a pillar of their economy. Like it's very important for them, and they've sort of shifted that from Europe to non-Western markets because of the sanctions. Particularly China and India, which has helped them maintain significant revenues despite the sanctions. And of course, looking at Russia's military-industrial complex. That is also quite big. It's placed a big emphasis on developing its own domestic military-industrial complex after being cut off a lot from Western arms and technologies. And in terms of weapons and defense systems, Russia is obviously still producing and exporting its own air defense systems, fighter jets, and tanks like the S-400 air defense systems. And going back to the discussion with India, they have strong export ties with delivering a lot of missile defense systems, and they have and they have a good development of indigenous financial systems after their ban in the Western markets. So I believe they're making good strides towards self-reliance, but there are big challenges there as well, such as the technology and industrial dependence, due to the fact that it's heavily reliant on Western and Asian countries for advanced semiconductors, microchips, and telecommunications equipment and software as well, which is could be a big challenge because isolation would essentially mean technological isolation as well for them. Russia's auto industry has been crippled by the lack of imported parts. Like many Russian car manufacturers have had to sort of pause production or resort to outdated models, which is not obviously not good for that sector of the country. And there's economic isolation and market losses could be a major factor as well in the long term. So I think as of now and going forward as well, there's sort of a partial self-reliance with a lot of challenges. But I think it's important to also sort of talk about whether it's actually like sustainable and possible in the long run for them to be fully reliant, or would it just inevitably lead to global isolation?
Thank you, Mr. Rohan, Mahadik, Shazib Karim, and Arif Malik for sharing your opinions. And I would also like to add something about the self-reliance part, because a lot of people focus on Russia and its relationship with India and China, but they ignore, or they don't ignore, but they failed to look at the Russia's growing relationship with African nations. For example, as Western sanctions and geopolitical tensions have isolated Russia, particularly in Europe, Russia has sought to diversify trade and diplomatic relationships. And Africa presents a growing market with abundant natural resources and potential for political alliances. And Russia aims to enhance its global influence by positioning itself as a key partner for African nations, countering the influence of Western nations and other global powers like China. And Russia's engagement with Africa has historical roots dating back to the Soviet Union, where the USSR supported numerous African liberation movements and established strong ties with several African states. And this historic connection provides a foundation for contemporary diplomatic and economic hardships. And bilateral trade between Russia and Africa has seen notable increases. In 2022, trade volumes reached approximately $20 billion, a significant rise from $12 billion in 2021. And this growth reflects strategic push to deepen economic ties with the continent. And Russia primarily exports energy resources, including oil and gas, as well as military equipment to African countries. Conversely, Africa exports a range of goods to Russia, including raw materials, minerals, and agriculture products. And Russia is also a major supplier of energy resources, including oil and natural gas, to Africa. And the continent's growing energy needs and Russia's extensive energy resources align with agreements and projects in place to enhance energy cooperation. And Russia is also a significant supplier of military hardware and security services to several African nations, and this includes arms sales, military training, and security services, which have bolstered Russia's strategic influence on the continent. And Russia has also engaged in partnerships to boost agricultural and food security in Africa. This includes investments in agriculture products and technologies, as well as the export of agriculture products to Africa. And talking about specific African countries such as South Africa is a key partner in Russia's African energy strategy program, and the two countries have expanded cooperation in various fields including trade, investment, and technology. And trade between Russia and South Africa reached around $1.5 billion in 2022. And Russia and South Africa also collaborate within the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa framework group, using this platform to enhance mutual economic interest and political coordination. And after South Africa, Nigeria is also a big partner with Russia. Nigeria is Africa's oil producers and has engaged with Russian energy related projects. And Russia's Gazprom and other energy companies have explored opportunities in Russia's oil and gas sector. And Nigeria has also purchased military equipment from Russia and sought Russian assistance in addressing security challenges, particularly concerning insurgency and terrorism, such as but not limited to Boko Haram. And then there's Egypt. Egypt is another significant partner of Russia with growing trade ties and investments from Russia. In recent years, Russia has increased its involvement in African, Egyptian infrastructure projects and industrial investments. And Russia is also a key source of tourists for Egypt, and there's a growing cooperation in agriculture and food production. And Russia also invests heavily in infrastructure projects across Africa, including transportation, energy, and mining. These projects aim to improve connectivity and enhance economic development in key regions. And Russian companies are also involved in projects related to road construction, power generation, and resource extractions, contributing to Africa's industrial development. And Russia also engaged in technology transfers and collaborated projects with African nations, particularly in fields such as nuclear energy, space exploration, and medical research. And Russia has also offered scholarships and educational programs to African students, strengthening education ties and fostering long-term relationships. And so this highlights that there is a growing relationship between Russia and African nations. Are there any more opinions or information that you would like to add to the things that I've just said? Arif Malik, Shazib Karim, or Rohan Mahadik? Shazib, I see your hand is raised. Would you like to add anything? I believe that Shazib Karim is facing internet difficulties. Arif Malik, I see your hand is also raised. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, so I would like to add that Russia's like Russia is really trying to befriend African countries, and like many of the African countries like Nigeria, South Africa, they're close allies of Russia. And I think this speaks volumes to the fact that at the end of the day, like self-reliance as an economic, like basic economically speaking, for a country to be self-reliant, it is quite foolish, because why will you be self-reliant when you can trade and go beyond your production possibilities curve, which is like one of the first things that we learned in econ class. Like Russia's comparative advantage lies in its energy sector. So why should it like its energy sector lies in energy sector, so why should it specialize in technological sector? It doesn't make sense. They should just simply trade and go beyond their production possibilities curve. I understand the limitations that the international sanctions pose to that concept, and like it makes sense why Putin wants Russia to be self-reliant. But I don't think Putin really wants to isolate Russia, because as we have seen that Putin is really chiming in with the African countries, also with China and India. So I think at the end of the day, it's just another form of the new Cold War, that I like to say that it's basically the new Cold War, where instead of arms, we are fighting with money. And I think that Russia is definitely not gonna stay globally isolated like North Korea. They're like they have established military bases in Africa, in Djibouti, if I'm not mistaken, and not only that, like Russia's also, like, we have to understand the regional hegemony. I think is a term. Russia's regional hegemony in Eastern Europe and in Africa is also growing very. Like in Eastern Europe, it was always there, but I would say in Africa, at this moment in the 21st century, it's growing at an exponential rate, and it's really trying to befriend African nations. And for this reason, I would say that despite the sanctions by the West, I don't think in the long run Russian economy will suffer, because they have the they have their energy resources, and they also have their friends China and India. So China and India are basically like 50% of the world. So when you have such important friends like that, I don't think a sanction can really hurt you that much. But I would say sanction is hurting the people more than the country. Like even in Modelu, and like we discussed that the imposition of sanction doesn't really make sense because it hurts the general public more than the government. And like for instance, like from a personal anecdote, like in 20 like when Roman Abramovich was basically sanctioned by the US by the UK government, like me and Shazib, like we were quite devastated by the fact, because like Chelsea was already quite, because after that Chelsea was quite in a financially bad circumstance. And that really shows that the sanctions imposed by the West isn't gonna is gonna hurt the people more than the government. And at the end of the day, I think Russia's Russia's ultimate goal is not to globally isolate itself. I think its goal is to be self-reliant. But I think it's going to take time, and before that occurs, I think Russia will continue to trade with China and India and other African nations, which I think is more than enough for the Russian economy to sustain itself. So, Shazab or Rohan, would you agree as well?
Yeah. To chime in,
Oh yeah, you go, Rohan.
yeah, I would definitely agree. I believe that Russia's sort of incentives, or like in initiation into African relationships, is sort of like to counter in international isolation or global isolation, as you had said. And there are a couple of key engagements with African countries they've done as well, such as the Russia Africa Summit. It's been ongoing since 2019, and it marked a significant step in Russia's outreach to the continent. And since the onset of the Ukraine war, Russia sought to strengthen diplomatic ties with African nations that remain neutral or supportive of its sort of geopolitical stance. And there are, of course, economic and trade relations as well, and trade expansion there, as well as, of course, the incentives of military cooperation and security partnerships. So I do agree with Arif on the fact that Russia would be looking to do more, sort of looking to be more self-reliant, but also sort of strengthening relations with non-Western countries more towards Africa and Asia as well. But of course, they wouldn't be looking towards full global isolation.
Yeah, and to just chime in, I'd also say like Arif, I completely agree with you, and also Arif about your point with Chelsea. Yeah, man, we were devastated. But anyway, talking about Russia and their relationship with the African countries, I'd say that, in my opinion, Russia's involvement in Africa reflects a broader ambition to exert influence in regions where it can challenge Western dominance, and Africa is a prime target for this strategy. As the West isolates Russia with sanctions, Moscow has turned to Africa as a region where it can leverage its strength in military power, resource extraction, and diplomatic influence to act as a regional hegemon in some way. And uh, I know, to just give some information, like I learned what regional hegemon is. Like we really focused on this topic in IB Global Politics with my teacher, Mr. Banks, and both the Malik brothers and Rohan. They know Mr. Banks very well as they worked with him in Model MUN. So, regional hegemon is typically a state that holds dominant influence over a particular geographic area, often using its economic, political, and military power to shape the policies of other nations in that region. And in Africa, Russia's efforts aren't about becoming the sole hegemon, given Africa's diverse set of powerful actors like China, the US, and the European Union, but about creating spheres of influence where it can be the dominant player. And Russia is achieving this by focusing on areas where it holds competitive advantages, such as arms sales, military training, and access to natural resources. By building strong bilateral relationships with key African countries, Russia is working to shape the balance of power on the continent, ensuring that it can counterbalance Western influence and exert control over African political and economic decisions.
Thank you, Shazib Karim, Rohan, Mahadik, and Arif Malik for all the opinions that have been shared. I believe now that we're very close to our end of discussion today. We're very close to the end of our discussion for today. And again, the difference between the two words, self-reliant or global isolation, is that self-reliance means that Russia itself, the self-reliant based on our assumption is that Russia is self-reliant on itself and on its key partners in Africa and China, such as China and India and African nations, and also former Soviet bloc countries. And global isolation means we are assuming global isolation to be that Russia is totally shutting itself from the rest of the world and it's not doing trade with any other country in the world. While we're assuming that self-reliance is that Russia is reliant on itself and on African nations and on nations such as China, India, and some former Soviet East bloc countries. And based on the discussion today, I believe that the conclusion that we can draw is that Russia is doing a lot of trade. Russia's sanction economy is doing a lot of trade with other nations such as in Africa and also with India and China. For this reason, the conclusion that we can draw is that Russia's economy is becoming a self-reliant economy instead of a global isolationist economy. That's the conclusion that I think we can draw. Is that a conclusion that Arif Malik, Shazib Karim, and Rohan Mahadik that you agree with?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with that as well.
Yeah, I concur as well.
Thank you for Rohan Mahadik for joining into today's discussion. Again, today's discussion was episode 21. Russia's sanction economy, self-reliance or global isolation. Thank you, Mr. Rohan Mahadik, again for joining into this episode. Are there any final words, Rohan Mahadik, that you would like to say before we depart for today?
No, I had a pleasant time on this on the podcast, and I'm looking forward to hearing more from you guys in terms of what you do in the future. And yeah, keep going with this. Keep going strong with this. It was nice to be here.
Thank you, Mr. Rohan Mahadik, for the comments. We really appreciate it. Again, to this topic of discussion was episode 21, Russia's sanction economy, self-reliance or global isolation. And the conclusion that we drew up is that Russia is becoming more of a self-reliant economy. And again, thank you to the audience for listening on to today's episode, which was episode 21, Russia's sanction economy, self-reliance or global isolation. And that is the end of our discussion for today. And we hope to see you next week with another very interesting topic, with another very interesting guest speaker. Thank you and goodbye for now.
I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit.